What are the basic characteristics of these organisms? Well, fungi, for example, are organisms that have a cell wall and must obtain their nutrients from outside. Plants have a cell wall and can manufacture their own food molecules. Animals do not have cell walls, but they are unable to manufacture their own food molecules, so they have to get them from elsewhere. Okay, and then protists have many characteristics. Some of them cannot make their own food molecules. Some of them can, just like plants. Okay, so that's why they've been divided. One reason why they've been divided into multiple kingdoms. All right, so your major task here is to know the 3 domains, the 4 kingdoms, and their basic characteristics. Okay. All right, so what is life? You may think I'm jesting when I say sex and beer, but it's not too far from the truth. Okay. Reproduction is a major hallmark of living organisms. All right. Beer isn't, but maintaining order by using energy that you obtain from other sources. That's a hallmark of life. Okay, so those are 2 of the characteristics. If you're a connoisseur, you could replace beer with wine, I suppose. All right, so those are 2 hallmarks of life. It's sort of instructive to stop and think about what are living organisms. How do you define life? Do you define it by how they move? Okay, a living organism moves, fine, but shoot, rocks can move. Okay, they roll down a hill. Do they all do reproduction? Well, yes, they do. That's a hallmark of living organisms. They all have to obtain energy from other sources. They have to do some other things. They have to maintain a steady state. You can't have wide fluctuations in their chemistry. Okay, so living organisms expend energy maintaining a steady state, a steady set of conditions within their cells. Okay, they grow and develop. That development process may be very simple in the case of a single-celled organism. In the case of multicellular organisms, it may be extremely complicated. Look at the development of a human, for example, or indeed any vertebrate. Very complicated process. They respond to the environment. Okay? If there's some sort of environmental stimulus, they respond to it in some way. Plants grow towards the light. An animal may move away from a noxious stimulant. Okay? They have cellular organization. A hallmark of living organisms is that they have cells, even if they're only single-celled. Okay? You remember last time I said the cell is the basic unit of living organisms. Okay? They use genetic material, either DNA or RNA, to store their genetic information, okay, and to process it. And so all organisms are doing that. And all organisms evolve. They change over time. Okay, and that's really all I mean there by evolution. It's a change over time in its simplest sense. Okay, so let's think about this. Which of the following is not true? We've got 5 statements here. Okay, so take about 30 seconds, try to decide which of those statements is an incorrect statement. If you're not sure, feel free to discuss it. Okay, this should be fairly straightforward if you were paying attention to the last slide, I hope. How many people say A? Okay. B? Okay. C? Good. D? And E? Excellent. Yes. E is the correct answer because it is incorrect. The cell is the smallest unit of life. Therefore, one hallmark of life would be that it has cellular organization. Never mind how many cells. Okay, there are many, many single-celled organisms that show all of the basic characteristics of living systems. Okay. Many-celled organisms are multicellular. In this loosest sense, multi means two or more. And then organisms that have only one cell are unicellular. So those are two terms that you should be aware of, unicellular and multicellular. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned this at the start. I know there's been a lot of difficulty getting these PowerPoint presentations checked out. I just put 5 more copies in the library this morning, so you should have an easier time of getting them. Okay? All right. Moving on. Another basic concept that this chapter introduces is the concept of evolution by natural selection. We won't deal a lot with that in this particular course. Biology 102 is where we go into that in very great detail. But it's important to have a basic understanding or concept of at least what evolution by natural selection means, because there are a lot of misconceptions about it. This, of course, is Charles Darwin. This is a photo taken when he was a little bit younger, after he'd come back from his voyage to South America on the Beagle. Okay. The basic idea is presented right there at the bottom of this slide. Nature gets rid of individuals that can't compete as well. Okay, that may take many, many generations because they may only be slightly less competitive than others, but it will eventually happen. Okay? That's in a given environment. If the environment changes, right, such that the conditions are different, then different traits may be favored. Okay? Different individuals may outcompete others. So changing environments can radically modify what's happening with natural selection. But this concept is perhaps one of the simplest in biology, and it's hard to understand or believe how much it's been misrepresented, especially recently. And so what is evolution by natural selection? It's not maybe what you think. There are some basic tenets of natural selection. There is variation in populations. Right? Lest you doubt that, look around the room. Right? We have a population in this room where we have lots of variation in individual characteristics. That is true of all populations. Some have more variation than others. You might be surprised to find out that humans as a whole have surprisingly little variation in their populations as compared with other species. Okay? Some of that variation is inherited. That is, it's passed from parent to offspring. Okay? Some of the variation is not inherited. It is environmentally induced. Okay? That variation selection cannot act on. It's only heritable. That is, variations or traits that are passed genetically from one generation to the next. Okay? More offspring are produced than can survive. This is true for many, many, many species. Not so much humans anymore because we have medical advances. Okay? We're able to take care of offspring that otherwise might not survive because of their traits. Okay? Many may die. There aren't enough resources for everybody, so the offspring are competing among each other for resources, for food, for territory. Okay? For everything, all those abiotic factors that they need. So offspring compete. If those offspring, if individuals have inherited an advantageous trait, they survive to reproduce. The ones who don't have those advantageous traits die or reproduce less. Okay, so the traits that allow a better reproductive output are the ones that are favored. They increase in frequency. because the individuals that don't have those traits don't reproduce as much or at all. Okay? It's that simple. And that's natural selection. It is not survival of the fittest. Okay? That's a very unfortunate term that Darwin used and has been added ever since. But it's not survival of the fittest. It is the survival of the most fecund. That word means good reproduction. If you are fecund, you reproduce lots or well. Okay? So it is survival of the most fecund. You make the most babies, you win, as long as those babies also are better at making babies. Okay, here's a diagrammatic example of what's going on. This is a figure from your text. We have variation that exists in populations. Up there at the top of the figure in part 1, you see a population of beetles with varied inherited traits. Some of them are brown, some are yellow, a few rare individuals are blue. Okay, so there's our variation. Some variants confer an advantage in this population. Okay, perhaps the yellow ones are very bright and predators see them. And so in part 2, the yellow individuals are being eliminated. That trait confers a disadvantage. As a result, fewer of them are going to be available to reproduce. Okay, whereas more of the brown and purple individuals are going to be available to reproduce. And the result is that when they reproduce, the traits that they carry are passed to their offspring. And therefore they increase in frequency. Because there are so few individuals with a yellow trait that have survived, that trait has decreased in frequency. Okay? Do this long enough, and actually sometimes it doesn't take a long time. Do this long enough and you get individuals that are dramatically different in their traits. They may be unable to reproduce with each other. So you have two different populations from an original population. The two populations can't reproduce with each other anymore. And by golly, those are separate species. Okay? So it leads to the formation of new species, or can lead to the formation of new species. It does not necessarily take very long. Plants can produce new species in as little as 1 generation. It's pretty amazing. And we have numerous examples of that sort of thing happening. Okay, so traits that are heritable and increase reproductive success are favored, others are not. That's probably perhaps the most important statement of these last 3 slides. That's the meat of natural selection, right there. Traits that are heritable and increase fecundity, reproductive success, are the ones that are favored. If a trait doesn't affect reproductive success, it can't be selected for. Okay. So we have an antibiotic that kills the vast majority of a bacterial population. Okay, what would you expect in the next generation? Okay, there's your 5 choices. Go ahead and take 30 seconds and see if you can figure it out. Okay, let's see if you can apply the concept of natural selection to a real example, because that's what this question is asking you to do. Okay. How many people think that the survivors or next generation would be just as susceptible as the first generation? Good. Okay. How many people think would be more resistant to the antibiotic? Okay, majority. What about C? Anybody think C was okay? What about D? Would they be more virulent? Would they be more infective? Okay. And of course that E is sort of a extra answer that you don't really need to worry too much about because it's clear they can't do all of these things. Okay. You'll find occasionally that I'll have questions that are like that. There'll be one or two answers where you can immediately eliminate those possibilities, and if you're guessing, then it gives you a better probability of guessing the correct answer. It all has to do with test-taking strategy, and I'll actually go over a little bit of test-taking strategy when we look at our review for the first exam down the road. There's some little tricks you can use to improve your odds of getting an answer that you're clueless on. Okay, what's the answer here? The answer is, in fact, B. Okay? The survivors survived because they had a gene that conferred resistance to the antibiotic, which means that even though they've been drastically reduced in number, they're going to build up, and if you are exposed to that antibiotic again, it's going to do nothing. This is a major problem. This is why we are having to try to find new, stronger antibiotics to treat bacterial infections, because it's as if there's an arms race going on between us and the bacteria. It really is a war. We give someone an antibiotic, they have some bacteria that are resistant. Those resistant bacteria then persist, and we have to use a different antibiotic to treat it next time. Okay? Many people don't take to heart the pharmacist's note that says, always completely finish your antibiotic. The reason you must do that is because if you don't, if you stop taking it when you feel better, you haven't eliminated those bacteria yet. And what you do then is, even though you may not get sick again, you're harboring those bacteria that are resistant, and you may transmit those to someone else. Okay, we're starting to run out of antibiotics, and it's actually starting to get a little bit worrisome. There are few that we have now that some bacteria can be killed with. Particularly staph infections. Hospitals are the worst place in the world to get an infection because the bacteria in hospitals are resistant to darn near everything. Okay. All right, this figure just seeks to drive home the importance of biology to our everyday lives. These are simply magazine covers that illustrate some of the topics in biology that we would be covering in this class and perhaps in some others, 102 and 103. Okay, hepatitis C it's a nasty virus. It's hard to control. It's easy to get. So that's an important issue. Everybody's concerned about staying healthy. What do you do? Are there tricks you can do to make yourself healthier? Breast cancer is really an interesting topic right now. We've discovered two genes that confer familial susceptibility to breast cancer, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And it's really interesting to look at what's going on with trying to control breast cancer in these families. Right? Designer pets, you might think that's kind of a joke, but it's not. I mean, there are a lot of people that have asked to have their pets cloned. Okay? They're also trying to figure out how to put specific characteristics in specific animals. Humans are the next step. I mean, if you can engineer an animal to have specific traits, why can't you engineer a human to have specific traits? Well, the answer is potentially you can do exactly that. All right, so you may have heard the term designer babies. Well, designer babies are not that far off. There is a group in the Mediterranean somewhere. They haven't told where they are for obvious reasons. They are trying to clone a human, and they claim that they've already got an implanted embryo in a volunteer who is a cloned human, has been cloned from an adult cell. Okay, so despite our fears of cloning technology and trying to clone humans, And I fear that that would happen. It's happening. Okay. So you may not like it. And I'll tell you what, there are some real serious ethical and legal issues that are involved in a lot of these topics, but it's still happening. So you have to deal with it. You need to be able to understand it. Okay, so let's go ahead then and move into Chapter 2. Are there any other questions on Chapter 1 before we go on? Okay. I encourage you again, don't be afraid to ask questions. I know it's a little bit intimidating being in a room this full of people and, not wanting to be yours as the sole voice that's being heard. But don't be afraid. If you have a question, chances are a lot of other people have that question too, so don't be afraid to ask. All right, Chapter 2. Just enough chemistry to be dangerous. Well, I don't think you can even be dangerous given the little amount of chemistry I'm going to teach you. I'm not going to teach you how to make explosives from fertilizer, for example. I'm not going to teach you how to make a neutron bomb in your basement. And I'm certainly not going to teach you how to make a super virulent virus that would wipe out every human on the planet, even though I could. I'm not going to do it. Okay? What I am going to do is give you just enough basic chemistry so that you can understand how chemistry relates to life. Okay? We can really make a point that life is chemistry. Okay? At least on our sort of superficial biological level. We're not talking about the, the conscience level, a consciousness level that we might consider. But even there, a lot of psychologists are increasingly turning to understanding the biological basis of behavior to understand what's really going on with the nervous system, the brain, how we think, how we act, all of those things. All right, so life is chemistry. It is a inevitable consequence of the properties of matter. Right? It really is. Okay? The properties of matter really lend us to looking at living systems. Matter, anything that has mass and occupies space, is organized into atoms. Okay, so the atom, as I said, two sessions ago, is the fundamental unit of matter. You break down atoms, you don't have the properties of matter anymore. Okay, so it's organized into atoms with specific properties, specific components, and we'll look at some of those components. Atoms form bonds. They connect up with each other to produce molecules, which are clusters of atoms. And those molecules can have specific properties as well. Okay? Chemical bonds can be rearranged. Those connections between atoms can be broken and reformed to form new kinds of molecules with different properties. Right? How does that happen? Well, that's something that we'll look at in this chapter. Okay, and then finally, this chapter looks at water chemistry. Water is probably fundamental to life as we know it. There may be other liquids that are conducive to forming other kinds of life, not based on carbon like we are. Okay? But we're here, water is here, and water's properties have been instrumental in defining how living systems work. Okay? It's just amazing, the properties of water. So we'll look at those in some detail. All right, so those are the major concepts that you should be getting out of this chapter as you're reading through it and as you're following through this slideshow. All right, basic concept that I'll emphasize over and over and over again. Structure relates to function. Okay, the way something is built strongly relates to what it does in biological systems, in living systems. Okay, structure-function relationship is critical in understanding how biology works. So we start out with a molecule. This is a molecule of actin. Actin is a protein that is present in almost every cell, but specifically or especially in muscle cells, where it's used in the process of muscle contraction. Right? Every time you contract a muscle, you're using actin. Right? Actin, because it's a molecule, it's made up of individual atoms. It's a very complicated molecule. There's lots of atoms in there, but it's made up of atoms. Okay? So a molecule of actin is made up of many atoms. Actin itself is organized into fibers with another protein called myosin. And so the basic proteins that are involved in muscle contraction are actin and myosin. This is an organelle, right? So we're now sort of looking at the different levels of chemistry in biology. We have atoms, molecules, we have organelles. In this case, it's a myofibril, which is made up of lots of actin and myosin in an organized array. Okay, there's the cell and tissue level. Okay, you take a whole bunch of these organelles and you pack them into these muscle cells. Right? So muscle cells are just full of myofibrils. They can contract and shorten. Right? That's where we get our muscle contraction, because a muscle is made up of a whole bunch of muscle cells. Myocytes is the technical term. And those myocytes are full of actin and myosin that can shorten their length. Okay. We then go, at that point, up to the organ level. Okay. So you put a whole bunch of muscle cells together, you put some other supportive tissues together, and what you end up with, is an organ. Okay. This organ, a flight muscle in a moth, has not only the muscle cells, but it has nerve cells, so that the animal can control when the muscle contracts or shortens. It has tissues that support the muscle cells and keep them from tearing apart, because there's a lot of stress being placed on this muscle as it's contracting. And there are tissues that cover the surface of this muscle cell, okay, to protect the surface of it. Okay, so all of those contributing to the one function of contraction or shortening. That's the organ. Okay, so these are the sort of chemical levels that we'll look at for much of the rest of this class. All right, so let's start into a little bit of chemistry. Matter and elements. All right, I've used the term matter already, and here I define it, as your book defines it. Anything that occupies space and has mass. Okay, that definition breaks down a little bit when you start getting into subatomic physics, but because there are particles that can have no mass but occupy space. It's really bizarre. Okay, in fact, they may have a very, very tiny mass. I'm talking about neutrinos. All right, but for our purposes, matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. It's composed of chemical elements. An element is simply a substance that cannot be broken down by ordinary chemical means. Okay? If you do break them down, then using high-energy physics, then you lose the properties of that atom because you've busted it up. Okay? So there are subcomponents in atoms of elements. Okay, here is a table of some of the naturally occurring elements in humans. As you look at this table, you should be noticing that 96.3% of our bodies is made up of 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. These are the symbols that are associated with those elements, and that's how we use our shorthand to write out those elements. Instead of writing out oxygen to indicate an atom of oxygen, we just write an O. Right? And so every chemist knows what we mean. Same thing with carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. So every element has its own symbol that we use when writing out molecules containing those atoms. The rest of these are what we call trace elements. Okay? So of the 92 elements that occur naturally, there aren't very many of them really that are used extensively in living systems. Some others have been artificially constructed, but those atoms or those elements are very short-lived. They're radioactive. Okay? So only 4 are very common: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. And the rest of them are trace elements. So a good guide for a trace element is 2% or less. All right? Calcium, we only have 1.5%. Phosphorus, 1%. And then all the rest of these go down. These trace elements, less than 0.01%. Okay? Things like iron, you'd expect to have a lot of iron in your body because, after all, your blood uses iron to capture oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So you'd think, oh, well, we should have a lot of iron, but you really don't. Okay? Comparatively, there's not that much iron there. Okay? Most of the calcium that you've got is actually not in your bones, it's in your cells, where it's used for signaling purposes, for example. Okay, so anything that's 2% or less in our bodies we think of as a trace element. Okay, so let's take another question. Which of the following is not a trace element? Just look through the list and see if you can decide which one it is. Okay, again, this one should be fairly easy if you were paying attention. Of all of these, clearly iron I just pointed out as a trace element, so that's clearly not the correct answer. Potassium and iodine were low on the list. Calcium was at about 1.5%. So those of you that thought that E was the correct answer were absolutely correct. Okay? Only nitrogen is one of the big 4. Okay? The rest are present at 2% or less of the total. Okay. To understand how chemistry works, we need to take a little bit of time to look at not only the chemical properties of atoms, but also we need to look at a little bit of subatomic physics. Don't worry, I'm not going to stress you here. It's real straightforward stuff. You've probably seen it many times before. Okay? Atoms are not indivisible. They're made of smaller particles. In fact, those smaller particles themselves are made of smaller particles. Okay? This is where subatomic physics gets really weird. We won't go there yet. Okay? 3 types of particles in atoms. Protons, which are positively charged. Neutrons, which have no charge. And electrons, which are negatively charged. Okay, so protons, neutrons, and electrons. We break down an atom, that's what we find in it. Protons and neutrons are stuck together in the nucleus of an atom. Okay? And the electrons are very much outside the nucleus. There's a lot of empty space between the nucleus of an atom and the electrons that are outside of that nucleus. A lot of empty space. Okay? You might wonder why, if you've got a bunch of protons in the nucleus and they're all positively charged, why don't they repel each other? Well, the reason is a little thing called the strong force, and if you're interested, you can take physics to find out about that. Okay? But there is actually a force that holds them in place. They're stable that way. All right, so the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus. The electrons are outside. The classic scheme that you always see is that the electrons are sort of whizzing around on the outside, but that's not entirely accurate, as I'll show you. All right, protons and neutrons weigh the same amount. They have the same mass. We define that mass as 1 molecular mass unit, or 1 atomic mass unit, sorry. All right, 1 atomic mass unit. So you're looking at 1 proton, it weighs 1 AMU. Electrons are very small. They're almost massless. Okay? They are 1/2000th the weight of a proton. Okay, in fact, if you took all the electrons from all the atoms in your body and weighed them, they would weigh about 34 grams compared to your total body weight, whatever that may be. Right, so they don't weigh very much at all. We can ignore electrons basically when we're trying to figure out the masses of various atoms. Okay? Here are a few examples of atoms. We are looking at here a helium atom. We've got 2 protons that are colored pink, 2 neutrons that are colored black, and then 2 electrons on the outside of this nucleus. Okay? Those in here, they're being shown diagrammatically, but really the proper way to think of those as being in a cloud around that nucleus. Okay? The reason is because we can't know exactly where that electron is. Okay, so if you're curious about that, look at Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It basically says you can't measure the velocity and the position of a particle. You can't know it. You can't know both. Right? We also know that electrons don't have the property of angular momentum, so they aren't spinning, it appears. Okay? But for our purposes, we can sort of think of them as being in those orbits outside the nucleus. Here's a carbon atom. It's got 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons in a cloud outside of the nucleus. Okay. An atom of a given element will not always have exactly the same structure. There are isotopes of elements where the atoms may have slightly different numbers of particles. Okay, they have the same number of protons, but they differ in mass. And since the electrons are essentially massless, that extra mass must be coming from neutrons. So isotopes of elements are atoms that contain different numbers of neutrons. Okay? They differ in the number of neutrons. Right? For example, hydrogen has 1 proton, no neutrons, 1 electron. The plus charge balances the minus charge, and this is true of all neutral atoms. So if you have 1 proton, you've got to balance it with 1 electron. Okay? So there's hydrogen. There's an isotope of hydrogen called deuterium, which has 1 proton and has a neutron. Okay? It weighs twice as much, basically. So it has more mass. Most of the hydrogen that we encounter is the basic hydrogen with 1 proton and no neutrons. But some percentage of it is deuterium. There is another isotope called tritium, which has 1 proton and 2 neutrons. Now, you cannot change the number of protons without changing the element. Okay, so if you threw another proton in there, you wouldn't be talking about hydrogen anymore. You'd be talking about helium. But you can change the number of neutrons, and that's what's happened here. With tritium, we have 1 proton, so it's hydrogen isotope, 2 neutrons, and it's radioactive, which is sort of interesting. What that means is that the nucleus of that atom is unstable. What it does is it spits out energy in particles to drop down to a stable state. Okay? You try to pack 1 proton and 2 neutrons into a nucleus, and it just doesn't work very well. All right? The natural laws, the radioactive laws that govern that, won't let it stay together. Yes?
Was it the neutron that doesn't change, the proton?
It's the protons that do not change. Okay? Isotopes differ in the number of neutrons, but not the number of protons. Okay, all right, well, that's a good place to stop. We'll stop there, and I'll do a little bit of reviewing on Monday. So make sure you've read Chapter 2 by Monday.